everyone, and welcome to the New Earth Lawyer podcast. My name is Geraldine Johns-Putra. I'm a lawyer based in Melbourne, Australia. I'm speaking to you from Bunurong country, so I wish to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Amar Dhall, a true polymath. Over the last 15 years, Amar's career has evolved from being an award-winning university lecturer and obtaining a Ph.D. to exploring the intersection between quantum mechanics and law, to being ranked as a top 10 chill-out DJ. He brings a fierce intelligence and deep authenticity to find balance between science and art through every encounter and in all of his work. He's a highly skilled, experienced clinical psychotherapist, a counselor, a coach, a somatic experiencing practitioner in training. He is experienced in the fields of trauma, well-being, and sustainable high performance, and is one of the directors of the Canberra Trauma and Wellbeing Centre. Amar, welcome. Welcome to the New Earth Lawyer podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me, Geraldine. Nice to meet you. You
have one of those bios where, I don't know where to start. Because there's so much in there I want to ask you about. But I'm gonna be traditional and ask you to tell us how it all came together, how you ended up doing all of these different things.
Okay. Well, I think it's kind of almost, it's not an incredibly romantic story. It's almost like going to a shop and trying on lots of pants until I get the ones that fit. The corollary to that, I guess, or something that's going to give a little more context, is what's motivated moving from one choice to the next, and one discipline or one pair of pants to the next. And it's been really I've been open to doing what's felt meaningful in the moment, and that's kind of what's driven me all the way through. And it's kept me willing to change things. When something's no longer meaningful, then let go of it and see what the next iteration will be.
So there was you had experiences, you had a career pre-law.
Correct. Yes, right? I was at that point. I had a small crew of people and was doing property and property development and renovations and reselling, flipping houses, etc., that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And then you decided to study law because you thought that was the next experience calling you.
I grew up with a bunch of friends where a lot of them went to law school, and for me, high school was much more of a social event. But it was in my back pocket that it was something that I'd like to do when I felt that I actually was really ready to see what I was capable of. I think for me, what I learned later, looking back on it, being born with a modicum of natural intelligence, it was much easier to coast through life, not really try, do okay, than it was to actually really lean in, do my absolute best, risk failure and judgment, and see where my capacity would run out. So it was kind of growing into that, being ready for a real challenge.
And on this podcast, I tend to interview people who've done quite a lot of self-reflection, who somewhere along the way decide that they want to, they're making a change within themselves, and or they want to impact the world in some meaningful way. So when you moved from property and property management and development into the law, what was your inner world like at that stage?
So at that time, I came to study law at an undergraduate level at 28 years of age. So I'd gotten to the point where I really enjoyed the property sector, primarily because of the personalities that I would work with. I had some incredibly interesting people that I would employ on site, and there's a lawlessness that can kind of run around that industry, which I quite enjoyed.
Yeah.
The shift was really, as I said, wanting to see where my potential lay, and being open to, definitely very pro seeing the world more connected, better opportunity to quality life, education, opportunity, all these sorts of things. So, and justice. I came into law school with very high-minded with justice, probably further left leaning when I came into law school. And as I made my way through, still left-leaning, but I think a little more pragmatic, and understanding how things actually work systemically was one of the great gifts of a law degree. So I think that a measure of pragmatism crept in. I think I never necessarily thought consciously, how do I want to do, what's the big meta piece that I want to do with, this empowered information of law? Really, for me, it was much more when I was on the ground in front of me and I'm faced with a decision or an opportunity to support someone or something or a cause. How can I do that? And that was more so it was the micro leading to the macro.
Yeah. And then you did your law degree. You're based in Canberra in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Did your law degree, did you go out and practice law when you finished?
I was going to, and I'd had a bit of a spiritual epiphany while I was towards the very end of my undergraduate degree, and ended up exploring what became my doctoral topic, which was quantum mechanics and law, and human consciousness plays a part of that as well. And I can unpack that a little if that's of interest to you. But in broad strokes, it was when I finished my undergraduate, I was offered a scholarship to continue and do some postgraduate work, which then turned into teaching opportunity, which I did. And then when I finished my PhD, that's then when I went and did some practice and was offered it was a small firm where I did my placement and was offered the opportunity to open up my own office wherever I wanted with that. That was, they saw an opportunity there to expand. At that point, then I looked through whatever areas of law I thought I may want to practice in. None of them really resonated in a way where I said, yes, I'm prepared to commit my life to this. And that was then what led me to exploring more the therapy, coaching, empowerment side of things. The other piece of that was, I said in my thesis, I looked at quantum mechanics, human consciousness and law and how those things kind of fit together. So, is it appropriate for me just to say a little bit about that? Because
yes, if you weren't going to, I was going to ask you to. Sure.
So, what I saw was, I'm trained in an Australian university, so in Western, empirical sort of tradition, which means to understand something, we look at its parts, its reductive inquiry. And so when I would look at certain things that would happen in law, I'd see that there's the kind of procedural regime, the structural regime that's there that kind of supports the happening. But then as that kind of gets really pulled apart, then I began to see there's more subjective reasoning that judges use, that legislators use, and then pulling that apart, I began to find my way into legal philosophy. And it's basically just asking, why is that the case? And then deconstructing, I came to see that really, everything, including law, comes down to two fundamental questions. One is, what's the deepest nature of the essence of the thing that's being regulated? And that's physical objects and people, so that's quantum mechanics. And then the other part of that, or the other side of that coin, is what's the deepest nature of the thing doing the perceiving, and that's the human. And so the reasoning went, well, it may seem like it's not very logical to go, well, let's have a system of law that integrates quantum mechanics into the way it looks at the universe and the way it structures regulation. But the argument is actually pretty sound, and it's that good law always goes beyond the appearance to look at the essence of whatever it is that's going on. So, what appears to happen in a situation is actually gone beyond in a trial to try and get to the essence. What's actually at issue here? Similarly, legislators, when they seek submissions from people around a new area of legislation, they go beyond kind of lay perspective and try to get to the essence and integrate it. So, it stands to reason that good law would look at then the essence of what it is that it's trying to regulate. So I'll start with that and see. Yeah.
So that essence that you're talking about, is that what we sometimes call truth? What was the truth of what happened, or justice?
Well, I mean, they're really big words that you're using. You know, I think truth ultimately is not something I think that any one of us can know. You know, I think at the end of the day, what we're more looking at, what can we individually and as a species see to the horizon of our understanding, knowing that that's going to potentially be pushed back as technology improves, as we spend more time as a species living, 80-year lives, around what we do now. I mean, 2 or 3 generations ago, that wasn't a thing. I think as a species, we're maturing bit for bit, and that shapes our perspective and our values orientation. As I said, technology is there. Making sure that we, and now to bring this home to lawyers, aside from the fact I think there's a case to be made for looking at, quantum mechanics and so on, making sure that we remain in dialogue around some of these meta issues, because the flip side is things in law it's the squeaky wheel kind of thing that will actually develop or squeaky wheel metaphor. An area of law that's troublesome will attract attention, potentially litigated, or some, if there's a political agenda around it, it's discussed.
But the ideal subject or case,
exactly,
will be the one that gets up.
That's right. Whereas some of these really important foundational meta values and beliefs and orientations about where we're going as a species and what our relationship is with law may not get the airtime that it deserves. And so I think there's a real duty, I would say, for lawyers to keep this conversation alive. So we're looking at the parts of law that may not get a light shined on them in the technical rolling and the technical discharge of what lawyers do when they're actually doing law.
Yeah, fascinating. So in your thesis, did you focus on lawyers who are practicing law, or did you focus on lawmakers, or did you focus on the courts?
Yeah, I focused on the fabric of legal reasoning.
Okay.
And wanted to introduce a way, so it was more a paradigm, it was a paradigmatic piece of work that would say that there is a paradigm that I didn't go as far as that in my thesis, because the actual novelty component of a thesis isn't huge. It's mostly literature review and positioning it and so on. But I think what used to be fairly stark and easy lines to divide some of the paradigms of law, like, for example, legal positivism and natural law, for example, that are taught in law school, the boundaries that would separate them have blurred as technology has moved on. For example, and what I'm getting at here is, data and empirical method gives us a lot of insight. But one of the things quantum mechanics shows us is that measurability is not always possible, and our capacity to now see that, well, measurement is not the only way of creating a picture or relationship with reality that's defensible. What does this mean for us as lawyers, as a concept, or what does it mean for the law as an organizing principle of society?
Okay. So did you find, in going to this dichotomy between the basically the subject, the perceiver, and the object, did you find that you were also thematically re-examining this whole idea of the reasonable standard in law, or the objective standard in law?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a paper I never got to write, but I would love to have explored the reasonableness of someone as actually being reason able. And for us as a species to see when we apply reason, because what we're talking about here is applying reason widely, and seeing, as I said earlier, if I think of law as an organizing principle that's applied to our our interactions. Well, how do we make the way we apply law and the fabric of it actually reflect that which our species is capable of doing reasonably? So yeah, I think it definitely did that.
So it seems to me like your work, either there's plenty of strands for you to pick up or for others to pick up. And are you seeing that? Did it generate interest where you think that there's a legacy or a path for others to follow and expand on?
It was strongly polarizing. You know, I had people tell me either they, you know, I got you know, I got bullied at work by certain academics, which was a really interesting experience to see and live through. And then I had other people that really support the work. And so, yeah, I also think it's a really quite a bizarre experience to have to not be seen as a person, but to be seen for one small part of the work that I do, and for that to be kind of inflated and then pinned to me as a definition of who I am as a person.
Which is kind of the risk that we all take when we put ourselves out there and say, I'm going to stand up for my truth or say what's on my mind. You know, I've experienced it in different ways before. Not bullying, luckily, and it's very unfortunate to hear, but always at risk of being pinpointed for that thing that you dared to say. So thank you for actually putting yourself out there and contributing a very important perspective.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think, I mean, it kind of ties into, I guess, the conversation we were having before we started recording around forming a relationship that's meaningful, you know, individually to the law that, you know, I enjoyed I enjoy law. I love the law. It's one of the things that helped me get to the pointy end of my cohort was the fact that I loved it. Otherwise, you know, it's arduous and time consuming and onerous to study. So I think allowing myself permission to form that personal relationship with it and choose to make it meaningful to me. You know, I mean, it's not necessarily the subject of where we're going to go, but I'll mention it briefly because I think it kind of comes into it. But, you know, it took the university almost a year and a half to find people who could mark my thesis. So I sat in limbo for that. Then, you know, if I go back to before I did my PhD, when I was doing my honors, you know, I came in towards the top. I think, you know, the top one or two in my cohort. I chose to do this topic exploring quantum mechanics and law. I had one supervisor quit. I was looking for another one. I went and saw the head of the honors program, and you know, she said, and she, you know, I have no issue with this. I think she was very sweet when she said it. She pointed out the choices that I'd made. She said, well, you know, it's a commercial law school. If you wanted to get first class honors, then you do, you know, the quasi judicial nature of the ACCC is a walk in the park for an honors thesis that'll get you first class honors and away you go. To choose to do quantum mechanics and law was to, you know, you've taken the risk. You may not pass if that's what happens. So in the end, I got, I think, you know, 90 something and did really well with it and the opportunities presented. But at each step, you know, I think Brene Brown calls it courageous vulnerability. To choose a meaningful path does expose the individual, in this case me, to the judgment of others. And part of the journey of life is learning how to hold that.
Yeah. Staying true to your purpose, staying true to your values. Extremely important. I've had actually, when I talk about those things, I've had the most feedback from people saying that that's really what spoke to them the clearest. Yeah, and there's also something that you touched on there that delighted me, which is that relationship to the law. I didn't step away from practicing law on purpose because I did my own purpose work. And one of the things that came out when I did that inner work, deciding what was important to me, about values particularly, was peaceful order and what law brings to a society is actually one of my values. And so I wanted to live that and contribute to it. That's why for now anyway, and for the foreseeable future, I don't want to step away from practicing. Like you, I love the law, and it's hard to describe what I love about it or even what it is. But it's such a fundamental thing to humanity that we all live in accordance with law. And maybe one of these days I'll actually, in conversation with you perhaps, or really reflect on what is this thing we call law, and why is it becoming seemingly more and more personal?
I mean, that's a huge question that you're asking, and why is it becoming more personal? I think that's a huge question. Part of it, you spoke to yourself where you've talked about forming your own relationship to it and detaching, and for you what that looked like was staying in practice, which I think keeps you on the coalface.
Yeah.
For myself, I don't think I've completely worked out how I will relate to law for the course of my life. At the moment, I did my thesis, as I said, and that was really focused on law. I went deeply into the quantum mechanics side, or as deeply as necessary for me to get that thesis. And then afterwards, part of what I thought, if my life's work was to be framed at that time when I finished my PhD, it would be to write this as almost as a manifesto as to how the law of humans could be aligned with the law of nature as best we understand her. And that allowed me to kind of detach a little from the practice of law and go more deeply into the nature of humans. Because I thought this is where there's so much pain caused in the interface between our humanness, whether it's mental health of lawyers, the stress of the process, the framing. It's one of the things that I've spoken about I've written it in a paper that's being published, but the idea that law students are taught that surrendering their emotionality is necessary to be a good lawyer because emotion is the death of reason is incredibly flawed reasoning. Paradigmatically, it's flawed. And I'm to go into the neuroscience of how we actually make decisions, the limbic system is such a central part, and it can't be severed anyway, is kind of a very relevant point. But learning about humans so we can create a system, as I said, from the lawyer's mental health to the way law is taught, to the impact on people who have to seek restitution through law, through to the way we treat criminals, pretty much at every point. I think there are really fundamental structural problems with the way we've conceived and implemented the legal system as it is now. So, my life's work, I think if I was to circle back to it, would be to make a contribution that may or may not have value to anyone else. But to me, it seems like it's a question that's worth asking and something that's there. Everything I do, it kind of is working or supporting me to gain more clarity on that.
Yeah, it's a rich tradition and a hallowed path you're walking. If you think about the types of people who contributed to the discussion of what is natural law, we're talking about Thomas Aquinas and Martin Luther King and all of these people who understood that there's a sense of something bigger than us when it comes to postulating and creating these so-called man-made or human-made laws. So I am fascinated to see where you go on that journey, and it brings us to what you've done since in the fields of trauma and well-being. So I'd love to hear about the work you're doing now.
Yeah, well, I'll just say one sentence to finish up that, because you kind of where my thinking is at as to what law would look like is the way I would see the paradigm now is I'd say that we're entering into a time where we would have a neo-natural law, and the neo-ness, the newness of it is that disciplines like quantum mechanics show the breakdown of the materialist paradigm. And I think that is something really exciting. It creates a much more open field for discussion. So anyway, I just wanted to finish that, and I'll put that aside now to answer your question about well-being and trauma. I'd say a fair number of, well, first I got into, as I said, therapy to understand people better and to offer something very direct to people where their lives are better for, or hopefully better for talking to me than not. In terms of what that looks like, I enjoy working with lawyers to help them find ways of bringing more meaning in to the way they relate to law, because I think, again, something we were saying before the recording button was hit, but the idea that the law exists, you're saying to this as something your own musing, the idea that the law exists as this objective edifice outside of human experience is a fabrication. I think the way that things change is by people doing what you're doing in their own way, going, okay, it's not that you escaped hard work, you got to the top of the profession, you got to partnership in big law, and then chose a different path. And I think that, and what I really like, or what I love about what you've shared of your story, was you didn't burn everything to the ground and say, no, I've got to walk away. You've seen how you can maintain connection to the best parts of it and move forward. So to me, that gets to the essence of well-being.
Yeah.
When we talk, if I was to talk about trauma, in really simple terms, trauma is automatic behaviors that people do that are essentially to support them to survive. Now, one of the systemic problems I think with that lawyers face as a group is that lawyers tend to be above average IQ and then below average EQ. And so that emotional intelligence is low. I'm curious, when we talk about trauma, well, one of the book which I'm writing at the moment is focused on people who learn that work is a smart way of channeling their anxiety. So high achievement as a trauma response. And there's lots of those people in law.
Yes, there are. Gosh.
Yeah.
That's very personal. I can relate to that.
Yeah. So it's actually supporting people to untie those knots, because there's an over-identification with achievement, which makes sense. It feels good.
Yeah. It puts you in control as well. It's measurable. You can put it up on a wall and get on with the day, because there's a
absolutely
there's your evidence.
Yeah, but does it give you control? It gives you the sense of control, but the rock in the shoe is that there is no control.
Yes.
And so I think, again, when we take these, and we're talking about the individual, and we're moving between macro and micro in this conversation, because, what is the macro other than the constellation of lots of individuals? But, when we then talk about the nature of a profession or a group, when we've got a group of people that have shared blind spots, as I said, maybe there's an addiction to achievement, where there's a generalized below average EQ, what impacts does that have on the people whom we're supposed to serve? And that for me is a really interesting question. So that's kind of the field that I like to play in, or one of the fields that I like to play in.
So you're working with people identifying this trauma response, which I have to say is the first time I've heard it put that way, but it's really striking and profound. And then they're going out, they're practicing lawyers mainly. Is that what the cohort?
Yes, they are. But what I find is that some lawyers with whom I work, their truth is to put down law and repurpose their skill. Yeah. Some it's to stay in law. So, I think that there's lots of lawyer jokes, but no one is disappointed when their child gets into law school. and I think that this is a really interesting dichotomy that exists about the nature of what it is to be a lawyer. I think one of the corollaries of this is that some lawyers can hang on so tightly to the identity of being a lawyer that it eats them from the inside out. Or they've ridden themselves so hard to get to the top. One of the things that I found when I was teaching on, and where I guess one of the early seeds was planted for me to become a therapist was, I was teaching for about 9 years at university, and I found one of the things with first years as a group for, as an example, is that they generally were the top in their schools, and then they come in to law school and they're suddenly average.
Yeah.
And that had a huge impact on them as a person. And so, in terms of achievement addiction, what do? Well, some of them work, lots of them just work harder. And that extracts a price. I think law is one of those professions where people really do leave, 7 to 10 years, lawyers leave in droves.
Yeah.
The profession.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting statistic. Why? And a lot of people that make that sea change do so for their health and well-being.
Yes, indeed.
So I think identifying that earlier, supporting them to potentially integrate and find a meaningful relationship to law will actually allow the profession to build a deeper reservoir of eldership in it internally, which I think would really be a beautiful thing to see.
A lot of what you're talking about resonates with the little bit I've done with Indigenous communities and their culture. So even this whole idea that the law lives, the law, the land, the people, and spirit, they are the four interconnected things. And until I heard that, I never really thought about the law as something that's living, breathing, and this is why, as I understand it, some Indigenous cultures, especially in Australia, when they do ceremony, they are actually reenacting the law, or they're living the law. And I think that has a lot to teach us. Plus what you mentioned about eldership. If we're coming through into a profession and we're having a sense of responsibility to more junior members, then to look upon it as a responsibility that has some sort of a divine aspect to it, that you're not just protecting that profession, and the members of it, but you're also looking out for the entire community, because good lawyers, or lawyers who are healthy physically and mentally, are going to be much better for everybody else. But thank you so much.
Yeah, well, you're picking up on, I think there's a few themes that are coming through. The idea of law being meaningful, finding service. We talked about what landed for me is a shared love of law.
Yeah.
That you and I share, and then you're talking in almost a sense of sanctity that's coming in. LORE and LAW. The LORE version of law having this embodied sacred aspect or sacred dimension to it. What is more sacred than love, whatever it is, whether it's my partner whom I love, or engaging in activities that I love. I think there really is this sanctity that can creep in, and when it does, it changes the doing. And
yes.
Yeah, and I think that's the bit to share, or to propagate in the discipline.
Well, there was one other subject I was going to touch on in the last few minutes we have left, and that is your connection with the Mankind Project. I think that what you're talking about, the idea of mentorship and the therapy that you're doing for lawyers, I'd love to understand how that's reflected in the work that you do for the Mankind Project, which is really around dealing, as I understand it, with cohorts of men to help them better understand themselves and their role as men in society.
It's an interesting question, how they connect. Well, firstly, one of the so I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a paradox, but one of the challenges, the Jungian term is enantiodroma, Are you familiar with that word?
No, I'm not. Please, could you explain it?
Sure. So it's to go into a polarity so deeply that it turns into its opposite. So an example of that would be, let's say I learn a bit about life and I become tolerant, and I become then an advocate for tolerance, and then I end up becoming such an advocate, such a passionate advocate for tolerance that I become intolerant of intolerant people. And so my journey into tolerance actually turns into its opposite, where I begin. Yeah. So where I would bring this back is, one of the things for men doing work around exploring their masculinity is it inevitably turns into them doing work to connect to their feminine aspect. Men can only go so far into that sacred masculine path or exploration without needing to connect to their sacred feminine. The path kind of turns into its opposite. And I think it's this, so where the two align is in the exploration of polarity deeply. So for humans, for lawyers, whether it's the Mankind Project or a lawyer, it's excavating what's meaningful. What is it that's truly meaningful to the individual? What are the obstacles that stop living a meaningful life? And identifying them. And sometimes, for a lot of people, how they come to what's meaningful is actually through finding the pain of all the things that aren't working in their life. And that being the crisis that actually really enlivens a search where they surrender to where that search needs to take them, rather than, if we go back to the achievement addiction, thinking that I've got control and I can do things and I can stay in control and I can map my life and engineer the way I think it needs to go, rather than actually, eventually that path unravels.
Yeah.
And people will come to the sort of questions that we're talking about, or aspects of self. So, it's all the same stuff, whether I work with lawyers or with men at the Mankind Project. Pain is pain, suffering is suffering.
Yeah.
And resistance is resistance.
So it's about rescuing that lost, ignored part of yourself, whether it's the emotional part if you're a lawyer, or it's that nurturing part if you are someone who's a stereotypical.
Yeah. Well, how about we reframe it? I'd actually say it's actually about rescuing yourself, and the part of the way you do it is by reintegrating the part that you've marginalized.
Yeah. Thank you, Amar. I really wish I had another hour to discuss all of these concepts with you, probably more hours, but gosh, thank you so much. Just scratched the surface of extremely deep subjects, and you've given me a lot to reflect upon.
Thank you, Jordan. It's been a real pleasure to meet you, and what a gorgeous way to spend a Friday than having a real conversation with a fascinating, intelligent, passionate human being about something that actually matters.
Bless you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.